Hey, y'all, welcome to the show. I have a really special guest here today. He has done numerous years inside of the Texas prison system, and he is a power advocate in Austin, Texas. Robert Lilly, welcome to the show.
Good afternoon. I was to say good morning. It's not quite afternoon, but good morning to you, Marci.
I'm
Yes.
so glad that you agreed to come on the show. I get to see some of the moves you're making in your community, and I'm just really impressed with the work you're doing. So I want to get to that for sure. Let's start with how much time you did in Texas prisons.
All right. Well, I'm going to first say thank you for allowing me this space to amplify my voice and my concerns. That means a great deal to me. And I know that you've been working very hard to elevate voices like my own. So I just want to express my deep gratitude to you first and foremost. I have done a life sentence incrementally. I mean, that's the way I term it. I'm 53 years of age, and I've spent approximately 21 years of my life cycling through the systems, beginning when I was 12 years old. So in my humble opinion, the way I characterize that is if I'm doing a life sentence on an installment plan. I was recently sentenced to 30 years. I did 4 years on that, and I've been out of prison now for 4 months. But when you look at my life course, over my lifespan, I've spent 21 years in prison.
I had no idea that you had only been home for about 4 months because you literally hit the ground running.
Yeah, when I left my last time, first of all, let me say this space called advocacy, organizing, and base building, that which is what I do here at Grassroots Leadership. It's not totally new to me because in the past 15, 20 years, I remember seeing voices and faces that reminded me of what I'm doing now, or that hinted at what I'm doing now. And slowly I started following the breadcrumbs, trying to emulate those examples that were put before me. So before I went to prison this last time, I had already been introduced into the advocacy space. I had made a lot of relationships, and those relationships sustained me throughout the 4 years that I was gone. So when I was there, I really never left, in essence, because while I was away, I was still working in prison. I was educating the men that I was in prison with. I was telling them about this world, this vast world of compassionate and loving folk of all varieties of humanity that were waiting to embrace them when they came home. They just but had to make up their mind that they wanted to do something different and that they wanted to be a part of the solution in this grand way, and the door would be open for them. I had experienced that the last time I was out. I had 15 years of freedom. The last time I was out, I made some really good decisions. I made some really poor decisions, but some of the best decisions I made were to be a part of this movement, to speak a new story into existence.
It's definitely a movement of formerly incarcerated people. And I think you kind of had a taste of it, and I hadn't. And so when I was in prison, I had no idea all of this was going on. So I love that you were able to share that and offer hope to people that might not have any hope otherwise, quite frankly. I want to definitely talk about, you said you started your journey with the criminal unjust system when you were 12 years old. Can we talk about that?
Yes, that's not a problem. What would you like to leave me with a question, or is there just a general ask?
Yeah, it's just your story. So
Yeah,
what you
yeah.
feel comfortable with sharing.
Well, trauma, and this is a new word for me, but it's a very important word. I think everybody that's watching this video today needs to go investigate what this idea represents. As a young person, much of my acting out was my trauma response. I grew up in an impoverished community in New York City. Harlem, New York is where I was born. I was raised in the South Bronx in the 1970s. It was a community that was devastated by poverty. It was devastated by the heroin, explosion of heroin in the community after Vietnam War. And so my community was not a resource community. That was number one trauma. Number two, at 8 years of age, I lost my mother. She would die of a kidney failure. And as a result of losing her, everything that was stable in my life was now tenuous. It was now delicate and it was fragile. And so my father, who loved us very much, there was 4 siblings, I'm the oldest, his aspirations were to hold on to us, make sure that we were safe. But how does a single parent do that and still maintain income for the household? So he made some decisions to bring, others into the home, other relationships, other women that he contacted. And sometimes those relationships were not healthy. They were not positive. And so you're just having compounded trauma on top of compounded trauma. So I realized today that a lot of my early acting out, by 12, I was already shoplifting. I was already experimenting with tobacco and marijuana. But these were all reactions to the pain that I was feeling, but I didn't even understand what I was going through. And so at 12 years old, I would catch my first arrest for trespassing. I was just a curious kid on a construction site. I was already familiar with the construction work field. My father was a tradesman. So I venture onto a site that doesn't have a fence around it, and the police come. And instead of handling me like a curious kid who stepped over the lines of boundary, right? I was addressed as a criminal, and I was remanded to the juvenile institution, and thus began just cycle of in and out. My mother and father, my stepmother and my father coming to pick me up, and eventually, at 15 years old, I would go away for 3 years, and I would come home at 18, going on 19. That would be my longest stay in the juvenile institution. But it was a cycle of between 12 and 15 short periods of stay. We're talking a night, we're talking 2 nights, we're talking a week, and then ultimately it would just snowball. And that's the cycle that this society subjects us to when it leans so heavily upon punishment and punitive solutions as the only solution to these very complex social problems that most of us have, and that I had.
You have said so many very important things. And the first thing that you were talking about, trauma responses. And that's one thing I learned in the penitentiary, is that those ladies I did time with were broken long before they ever committed their crime. And then you were kind of in an environment where you weren't taught any of those coping skills. So how can we expect an 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 15, 20-year-old young person to handle something properly if they've never been taught how to handle things, right?
Yes, we can't. And unfortunately for me, the system became that container in which I had to grow and find solutions to my very challenging problems. I don't believe we have to continue down this road. And that's why I'm invested in this work, because I don't believe any human being is disposable. This idea that we should lock them up and throw away the key is, to me, repugnant. And what I saw in prison, I saw beautiful human beings like myself that I finally could see as a beautiful person. And I saw we needed support, we needed encouragement, we needed resources, we needed language to identify the things that we were faced with. We didn't even have, things I'm talking about today, trauma. They're a result of the many influences that have later on come into my life to introduce new terms and new ideas that gave me a frame of reference to understand, wow, so this is what's happened to me, trauma. I took the ACEs score. I took the ACEs assessment, adverse childhood experiences, and I scored an 8 out of 10. So I learned that this ACE score is directly correlated to my substance use challenges. And so I grew up early exploring and experimenting with drugs, as many children do. But unlike many other children who didn't have the compounded trauma that I had, the coupling of that trauma with the substance just produced this outcome, which we now call addiction. And I became dependent on substances to cope with my pain, not knowing that that's what I was doing. But in fact, as I look back on my childhood and I remember the times when I was heavily using, it was when I was experiencing the most pain, when my family was the most unstable, when I would run away because I couldn't deal with what was going on at home. Drugs became my solace. Unfortunately, it's a solution that only has a temporary relief that it offers. And it's taken me years to realize that I cannot depend on a chemical to achieve the kind of quality of life that I desire. It's not a solution for me. And although I don't diminish the choice that someone else may make to use, for me personally, I've had to determine that total abstinence is the best solution. I can't use a little bit. For me, it's problematic. And every time that I have been back to prison, it has partly been associated with my substance use. And prison has been used as a solution to my substance use when I really needed treatment.
You've said a mouthful for sure that our country is kind of set up where substance misuse disorders are criminalized, and we are using our prisons as mental health establishments and substance misuse establishments instead of helping these folks and putting them on the right path and giving them the tools that they need to succeed. We are putting them in an institution that then causes even more trauma.
I agree. You know, I hear people say things like, well, if it hadn't been for prison, I wouldn't be alive. I know what they're saying, that they were on a very dangerous path that could have resulted in death. But I personally, because of the philosophy I've adopted as an abolitionist, do not believe that there's anything redeemable about these institutions called prisons. I believe that we have mischaracterized them as places of corrections. And in fact, a big word that I've learned that I'd like to introduce the audience to is criminogenic. Prisons are in fact criminogenic. They actually produce more unsafety in our society. They produce less stability in our families that are forced to now deal with the absence of a loved one, whether it be a brother, sister, father, uncle. The absence of that person to imprisonment is tantamount to death in that family. And so now this family is dealing with a loved one that is alive physically, but dead to them socially, and compounding that with the fact that they have to maintain solidarity with this loved one by visiting them hundreds of miles away from where they live, scraping up dollars to put money on their commissary, you know, trying as best they can to take their collect calls if they can't afford to set up an account. So instead of making our communities safer, we're being exploited in the name of corrections. And to me, this is the story that I'm so grateful for persons like yourself and channels like this channel to bring attention to. Unfortunately, many people are asleep at the wheel of the criminal legal systems. We don't realize how much harm is being done to us as a society, but it is in fact true. We're being sold a lie that prisons make us safer, and in fact, communities, families, and overall our society is made far less safe. In fact, the majority of the crimes that are committed in our society never go, quote unquote, punished or even identified because they go unreported. So prisons cannot, in fact, make us safer because the system doesn't have the capacity to deal with even all of the crimes that, if they were reported, were then subjected to investigation and eventually prosecution. It would be, you know, it would be foolhardy to believe that we could lock up everybody that commits all of these offenses. So we've got to look at alternatives. We got to look at options. And even though I'm an abolitionist, I lean towards the idea of restorative justice, because restorative justice is the idea that we as a community, we own our problems. So the harms that have been caused in our community, I believe is our responsibility as a community to strive with one another to figure out solutions to those.
What we know is that prisons victimize, they produce more victims. And it's not only the incarcerated individual, like you were talking, it's families, the family unit, the communities, the entire picture, right? So what does restorative justice look like, Robert?
Well, I'll speak directly from my own self. In one of the incidents that brought me to prison this last time, there was a victim. I was in a relationship, and the relationship was unhealthy. We were both using, and I don't mention using to excuse my behavior, because I think apart from my using, there were some issues with patriarchy that I had not yet worked through, and so I did not show up as the best human being in this relationship. And so we were not well together. I exhibited aggressive behavior in this relationship, and I was very remorseful for having inflicted any harm on this person whom I called myself in a relationship with. With that said, I learned later that there was an opportunity, there could have been an opportunity for us to sit down and have a mediator and work through our challenges. We didn't need to be together. The resolution would not have been we continue our relationship, but there could have been resources available to us to seek out the kind of healing that we would have needed so that we could make amicably go in our different directions and not return to heavier using, which is in fact what happened that led to my second felony infraction, which was evading arrest in a motor vehicle. Unfortunately, this option was never made available to us. And so restorative justice would look like to me that we would have had a chance to sit down with our community, with my pastor, with her mother, her sister, her other supports, and my other supports, and if need be, the prosecutor. And we could have talked honestly about how things had gone awry. And we would with the heavy penalties potentially on the table, we could have been encouraged to make a wise decision, which would be to seek treatment, to avoid contact with each other, and to, address the underlying issues that were at root causing some of our behavior, which was untreated mental health conditions for both of us. And that didn't happen. Unfortunately, the only option that was put on the table was imprisonment. The issue was not prosecuted, but I lament that because that was in fact the only infraction in my history that there was a victim involved in it. And I wanted to be accountable to address that. The evading arrest, there was no victim in this incident. And although I understand the harm involved in that, I was a reckless driver and somebody could have been hurt, my heart was heavier for the fact that there was a human life involved in this other affair, but the prosecutor decided he could not secure prosecution. And so he went with the charge that he knew he would get the greatest result from. And so I was sentenced to 30 years imprisonment for a third-degree felony, evading arrest in a motor vehicle with 2-paragraph enhancement. And at the end of the day, I asked myself and I asked the public, who was benefited by that? At 49 years of age, sentenced to a 30-year sentence, I would have to at minimum spend 10 years in prison. And my life wasn't irredeemable. I could still offer some good to society, but that was not considered because all they could see before them was somebody with a record, a long record, but they didn't want to consider the mitigating circumstances that contributed to some of these poor decisions that I was making. And so thankfully, I did get a chance to apologize to my partner. We did get a chance to embrace again and to make some semblance of peace with one another. However, it was apart from the system that we did this. And that to me is what restorative justice looks like.
We're putting all of these resources and money and people often talk to us about, hey, well, it's our tax dollars. We don't want them to get all this stuff. But the fact is we are pumping billions of dollars into this system. And instead, if we put those funds in an earlier community things like you're talking about, counseling, mediators, mental health recovery places, if we were pumping billions of dollars into there, dare I say, we wouldn't even need a prison because people would be handling the things inside of them that make them go commit a crime.
Something interesting, kind of speaking to that part about dare you say that we even need a prison. Historically, like 1972, during the Johnson administration, leading up to Nixon's administration, there was a report that was put out. You could investigate it. This report was a recommendation, it's a presidential commission, and the commission recommended that they put a cap on the years that they would offer anyone for a felony conviction at 5 years. Because they were realizing, even then in 1972, that lengthy sentences did not produce rehabilitative outcomes. And so they were encouraging a shorter and shorter time period for somebody to be incarcerated. Basically, they were leading towards the direction of decarceration, which is a step in the direction of abolition. And this was in 1972 during President Richard Nixon's presidency. And why is that important? Because that commission that was recommended, making these recommendations, they took every recommendation except that recommendation and put it into use. The very one that would have made the difference between 50 years of mass incarceration, which is what we're now celebrating in this year, makes 50 years of this exponential increase of people going into prison. We're talking 2 or 3 generations of people that have been impacted by incarceration in our society. It's tragic. And it can be undone because it has been done by human decisions. And just like human decisions created this system, I believe firmly that human decisions can undo it.
Thank you for that. Let's talk about the event that's happening tonight. Can you just kind of tell us about that a little bit?
Yeah, there's actually a couple of things that are coming up tonight. We're having a town hall meeting here at Grassroots Leadership. I'm here working as a criminal justice participatory defense organizer, which means we're responsible, my job is responsible for building our base. So we contact people that have an interest who have been directly or indirectly impacted by the criminal legal system, and we empower them with space to come and learn how to educate people using their stories, to educate the legislator so that we can advocate for changes in bills. We can put forth our own bills. We can mobilize when our communities are under attack with new punitive decisions that the local or state government is making. But we show people how to use power, collective power. Tonight, we're talking about diversion center. We're talking about creating the city's already on task to create a diversion center in the city of Austin. And we're part of that conversation because at any point that we can cut off the flow of people into the system, this is a conversation that we want to be a part of. So tonight's meeting is about the kind of care that people are receiving through integral care, because oftentimes people that are being cycled into the prison system have mental health conditions. And so this conversation that we'll be having tonight is critical toward that end, discussing what kind of services are being made available to us, how can we amplify those services, finding more people that are offering those services, and then bringing those to the county commissioner's court when the time comes for them to roll out the plan. They're going to have a pilot plan that's on the way to being rolled out, and then eventually there's going to be a full-blown diversion center about 2 or 3 years. And so we're fortunate because we're allowed, we've made a place for ourselves at the seat of decision makers, because we believe that nothing should be done for us without us.
I think it's so important to have formerly incarcerated voices in all of those plans, because who better to know the exact needs and then further marginalized communities as well. Also, you have the 50 years of mass incarceration.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And
yes.
That's a film?
No, actually, we're going to be doing, so we, Grassroots Leadership, Austin Justice Coalition, and with the Sentencing Project, this is actually an initiative put forth by the Sentencing Project. We're partnering with them to host an event at UT. It'll be at the School of Law at UT, and we're going to be deconstructing the 50 years of mass incarceration, which is important because we have to understand how we got here. I was so amazed when I was incarcerated and I began to look at the history of slavery in our society, for example, and we believe that what's happening with prison is tantamount to slavery in these modern times. And when I learned that one state after another would adopt the laws of another state, and little by little, this system became more and more solidified because the more states that embraced it, it became favored. And so policy is absolutely essential to undoing what's happened to us. So we're going to be looking at how policy has shaped what we now today call mass incarceration. If you look behind me, all of these images of persons that are behind me are the people that have been around in the 1990s to 2000s and now going into 2010s and 20s. We have a long legacy of folk that have been resisting this draconian system for decades. We're part of that. And so we're writing our history today by being a part of these events where we'll be sitting on panels, doing interviews like we're doing. When we're gone, when we're long and gone, this information will be floating around the internet and people will be able to hear our voices and they'll be able to hear our sentiments about what we felt was right and wrong. And even if we can't physically today change it, we're setting the trends that perhaps will lead to the solutions that folk will use tomorrow. And we're just fine with that. We believe that we all have a role to play in this work. And even if it's a very small role, it's a role that we can play to make a difference in the society. So yes, we'll be having 2 events. I'll share the dates and times and the particulars with you via text.
Yeah, please do. And I think that Robert's going to share maybe his social media links also. And you guys know you can follow me on Facebook too. And I follow all the groups here in Texas. If you're in Texas and want to get involved with that kind of thing, we would love to hear it. I want to kind of go back a little bit.
Yes.
We know that you're on solid ground. You're on the ground working towards change. I'm just thoroughly impressed with the things that I've seen you done. Like I said, I would have never dreamed you had only been home 4 months. I would have guessed 4 years. So
Actually 5 months. Actually 5 months. So
okay. Fair
yeah,
enough.
we're going to count all of them like we did inside. We're going to count every one of them. Mm-hmm.
Yes, sir. Absolutely. Mad respect for you for sure. Let's kind of get back to talking about your time in prison. You had said that you definitely met some incredible people there. Can we talk a little bit about the way that in female prisons, we kind of create a prison family, so to speak? Can we just talk about how men make those connections and bonds inside of prison?
Okay, well, thank you for that question. That's a very good question. I've read about the women's dynamics in the women's institutions. I actually read about it through Joyce Ann Brown's book, where she talked about, being the mother, and then you have daughters, and and that whole setup. In our scenario, it's a little different in that, but I think the spirit and the intent is the same. We're trying to find a family. Although for men, we create cliques. Some people call them gangs. Some people use religion, and religion becomes that bond that keeps them connected. So you have your Muslim groups, you have your Christian groups, you have your nationalist organizations. And so the structure is different for what it looks like for us to bond together, but we do the same thing. We come together in some way to fortify each other's humanity, or what we perceive our humanity to be. For me, I found a group of men who were all like me, persons who had started off as a juvenile going into the system. And we were all at a point now in our 30s, going into our 40s, where we were looking for answers. We wanted to find a way out of prison and to stay out of prison. That had never been achieved by any of us. All the men that I had known, we had never had any semblance of life outside of prison. So we formed our own group called the Universal Temple of Peace, and we sat down together and created a curriculum where we studied history, religion, local politics, business, everything that we felt would be needed to be a part of society and to thrive in society. We created a curriculum around that, and we used the Muslim program to bring us together, but we didn't teach Islam. We taught living life. We taught becoming, assets to our community, how to become a solution to the problems that we knew we faced in our community, because all of our lives were a reflection of it. Well, that group became a catalyst for the person that I am today. It was the first time that I found men who were not so rigid with their religious concepts that we couldn't talk about life on this earth, like walking physically and, being an asset in our communities tangibly, right? It was beautiful. I looked up one day and we had Black men, white men, Latino men coming into the door that historically had only allowed one group of people to come in. That was the beginning of me finding my voice and realizing that I had something to offer other people. And because when I would look out in the audience and I would see those men listening to the words that I had to offer, I realized that they were making me believe in my own self and my own gift. And so when the door opened up, and I was one of the first ones to come home, many of these men spent 20 years in prison, 25 years in prison. And I was one of the first ones to come home. I told them, and in my heart, I told myself that I was going to show them what loyalty and brotherhood looked like, that I wasn't going to forget them. And so when that door opened up, I made sure that I visited them, for some of them for 7 years, wrote them letters, sent them packages, books, whatever it took to maintain that kind of brotherhood. I fought tooth and nail to do that. And now all of us are home. I unfortunately went back. But even in that, there was some benefit, because it gave me a chance to see life in prison from a new perspective, one that I couldn't see because in the times past, I had no life outside. I had never achieved any life outside. Well, now I went back to prison having experienced some life outside. So now I could tell them of a new vision. And so I've now seen 3 generations of men be affected by some of the work that we did in prison during that time. And they've made an indelible impression upon who I am and how I see the world. And I'm grateful for the time that I've had with those men. And they are my family. They're my chosen family, just like this community of advocates and organizers and rabble rousers. You all are my family. You're my family.
Yes, I feel the same way. That's an incredible story. I love how you said that seeing how your story and your voice was positively affecting other people gave you more confidence and more courage. And I think that's so important that when we hear people, when we truly hear them, that's a gift we give to them, that they can get that, they can build up the tools that they need. That's putting little gems inside of them, right, for them to pull later when they need it. And that's incredible. I kind of got goosebumps when you were talking about that. That's how I feel about the ladies that I left behind. And it's so crazy. Even ladies that we had conflict with in there at some point or another, when all of a sudden when I'm here, none of that means anything. I just love them all, and I want them all to be successful and do what their heart desires and what's healthy and good for them. So I love that, Robert. Thank you for sharing that for sure. But it sounds like most of the time you did your time very productive. I did mine kind of rough. I dived into a lot of things that I shouldn't have been involved in and acted in ways that I would be embarrassed if my children saw.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just wondering about conflict resolution. We are hearing all of this violence that's going on in Texas state prisons right now. I mean, story after story. And I understand that that's always been happening. I just feel like the news media is kind of paying attention right now. But yeah, how did you resolve conflict in there and maintain your values?
Well, thank you. That's a great question again. I'm going to be quite candid with you. First of all, I've actually never had a fight in prison, not one. Even in my juvenile days, I've never harmed anyone, and no one ever harmed me. That doesn't mean the environments that I was in were not dangerous and they were not riddled with conflict. But I'm grateful that I have been able to navigate those spaces unscathed. That's not usually the outcome for many people. But I would modify my way of navigating the world because, I knew in the world there's a lot of space. So if I have a conflict with somebody, I can move around, and it doesn't have to result in me inflicting harm on that person or that person inflicting harm on me. In prison, it's a closed world. So there's not a lot of space for us to move. So I determined very quickly that I needed to figure out a way to navigate this that didn't require me to brutalize somebody or somebody brutalize me. And what that looked like for me was I watched people. If I saw somebody acting in ways that I knew were problematic, I just simply avoided them. I didn't allow them to get too close to me and get too familiar with me so that they would then direct that kind of behavior towards me. But the dilemma was I could not allow myself to be so aloof from them that I couldn't offer them any guidance or any wisdom. So my solution to that was I sought as best I could to be an example, to show them through my conduct and my behavior that you don't have to, because they put us in a cage, we don't have to act uncivilized. There were many men that didn't appreciate my performance, my effort. They felt like, it was a show. And that's all right. I gave them room to be who they were. Some of those same men are calling me on my phone today outside of prison. I just completed a 6-month drug and treatment program. And some of those men that feigned, obstinance and stubbornness, they were listening. But all in all, to answer your question about avoiding conflict, I think at the end of the day, I think it was about observing, to be aware is to be alive. That's one of the refrains that we use in recovery circles. To me, I had to be aware of the people around me. I had to recognize that if they're not going somewhere, then we don't need to be going together, right? Because I'm going somewhere. And if they're not motivated for life, the best thing I could do is just get at my table and study every day. And if you wanted to come over and sit down with me and read some of these books that I got, you're welcome. But if you want to go over there and gamble in the corner, then you expect me not to be there with you, because that's not the direction I'm going in. I've got a totally different purpose. And that's the thing. I had found my purpose. And that to me kept me focused. I didn't get distracted, because I knew I had something greater that I was living for. And I didn't know how that was going to be played out, but I knew it was going to be played out. I think that's the best answer that I can give.
That was a great answer. I'm wondering, was there a moment for you that you knew that this wasn't the life that you wanted? Like, was there a turning moment or a turning time, or what? Yeah. People are going to want to know how they can get like-minded, because it's easy to say, hey, I don't want to do this anymore, but to continue doing it.
Well, for me, like in some of the recovery communities, they have this thing called spiritual awakening, right? I'm going to use that as a metaphor. Some people talk about having one moment where they had this shining light shine on them and they were transformed. And then some people say there's an incremental, version of that. So like over the course of time, you have these series of moments. That was my reality. I would go back to prison, and there would be this new thing I would see. And it would add on to my life. It would give me a sense of depth in my identity and my value, my sense of value, my drive for the future. The biggest issue for me, however, was I didn't understand how complicated and complex substance use was. So sadly, I would return home and I would not put my guards up against allowing the chemicals to come back into my life and grab a hold of me. Finally, I think for me, it was a combination of feeling the pain of repeating the same mistakes over, and realizing that this pain was no longer something I wanted to bear. And realizing that I had to find a solution. At that point, I'm 49 years old with a 30-year sentence. This was my going into prison. I was making these decisions about how to turn. And basically, it was a combination of the pain of staying the same became far more costly than the pain of change. I knew change was inevitable. I needed to grab a hold of that line and say, take me where you want to take me at that point, but I can't stay the same anymore. And so it took me surrendering to a couple of things that I had never before wanted to surrender to. Like admitting that I couldn't use. Admitting that there was only one course of action for me, and that was abstinence. There was no such thing as moderation. There was no such thing as controlled use. I personally had no ability to do those things. I had to stop. And then, the choice to do that required me to grieve. I have been using substances for so long, they were my lover. And letting go of that lover meant pain. And I had to be all right with experiencing that pain and exploring what it meant to live life and just live it raw without the need for a crutch. That was the turning point for me. Embracing that it was all right to feel that pain to get to the other side. As they say, no pain, no gain. And I'd rather experience the pain of change than to keep experiencing the pain of failure.
That's been something I've had to learn along the way also, is that sometimes you just have to feel those uncomfortable and ugly feelings. And once you're done feeling that and process that's how the healing comes, not by kind of this temporary solution of outside things, whether it's money, substances, alcohol, all the other things, right? Shopping even.
I wanted to add on to that. I had this crazy notion that I could avoid problems in life. Like, man, surely if I had enough money, if I had enough influence, yeah, there's going to be problems, but at some point I'm gonna hit this plateau and there'll be no problems. It'll be smooth sailing. That was a foolhardy belief. I realize today that problems are a part of life. And that problems are really essential, because until I learn how to grapple and wrestle with my problem, I can't cognitively become more adept at living life. I have to have something that I struggle against to make me stronger, to make me more wise, to make me better. So And when I learned to think about things that way, when I changed my perspective about the world and I stopped running from the things that were uncomfortable and realized that these were just the way life, this was the way life was. My mother dying wasn't designed to destroy me. Unfortunately, it was something I couldn't control, but it was something that I could control my response to. And death is a part of life. And by me understanding and embracing that these things, whatever they were, from the death of my mother to the death of my brother to the death of my father, all things that I experienced after leaving prison, these were things that I could walk through and I didn't have to run from. And yes, they were going to be tough experiences and feelings, but they were designed to help me be of value to other people like myself that are going to be experiencing the same thing, because life's going to come at all of us. And so I'm privileged to have to go through this, because one day people didn't have the compassion for me, but I could have the compassion for somebody else. And I could stand there with them and say, you know what, we can get through this. There's a way to do it. Let me tell you how I did it, if you care to hear me. To me, that's a blessing. To me, that means I can be a wounded healer. Again, I want to say thank you. You're doing some great work. If what you're doing, amplifying our voices, I see what you're doing going to grow tremendously in the future. I'm proud of you, and I thank you again for making some space for me.
Thank you, Robert. I hope that you'll come back, because we want to keep up 5 months out. Well, we want to know what a year looks like, for Robert Lilly. We appreciate you. We appreciate what you're offering to our community, to your community, to your family there at Grassroots and Taj. And guys, I'm going to put all the good links so that you can keep up with Robert and his organizations that he's involved with in the description of this video.